Hey everybody, welcome back to Vanta EDC. Today we're going to be taking a look at this knife, which is the WE Knives and Gavko Knives High-Fin. So I'm just going to start by explaining some of the major reasons why I decided to ultimately buy this knife for myself. The first is that, ever since I started getting into pocket knives, when I started seeing designs by Gavko Knives, I found the aesthetic very unique and generally very appealing. I like a lot of these lines. There's a very organic look to it, but also an angularity. And I don't know if anyone can relate with this, but I kind of liken it to some of the aesthetics and the lines that you see in Lamborghinis, which I've long been a fan of. So yeah, I really like the aesthetic of Gavko Knives often, and this one in particular, I remember the first time seeing, I think it was like the Blade HQ, like coming soon page. I was like, oh, that's definitely a cool design. Thankfully, the longer I've been into knives, that's not even though I have an impulse of something looks cool, that doesn't mean I end up buying it, but that definitely helps because I am very much a function and form person. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I decided to get this knife. Another reason was I actually have never owned a titanium frame lock before, so this is my first titanium frame lock, and I feel like that's a pretty major category in the world of pocket knives. So I felt like it was important for me to experience a quality titanium frame lock just to have honestly reference and experience with. So yeah, another reason is, this being in at least for my budget, in a high-ish price tier. I think of this as somewhat like a gentleman's EDC knife, just because it's not like a cheap knife that I'm going to beat up because it's, easy to replace and that sort of thing. The design as well, I think, lends itself to being a more kind of EDC, I don't know, non-hard use knife, but anyway, you might feel otherwise. And then the last reason is when I actually bought it, I got a great deal on it. I think map pricing is like around $246. I could be wrong on that, but I got it for significantly less than that, believe it or not, brand new. So that deal unfortunately is no longer available, but needless to say, it felt like a deal I couldn't pass up because I had already seen the knife enough and, got an impression that it was a knife that I might want to try out. So when I saw a deal like that, it was one of those things where kind of in that way, it was an impulse, but I was like, well, this is a great deal, so I'm going to go for it. And I had the money. So yeah. So now we're just going to get into the small details of this knife and what I particularly appreciate about it. So the first thing, I think one of the most appealing aspects of this overall knife is the blade itself, which, some people would say, obviously, if you buy a knife, the blade should be a really big plus about it. But, sometimes that isn't the biggest positive about a knife. But for me, I think the blade in several respects is the biggest positive thing about this design. So first of all, I really love the silhouette, the shape. So this is some sort of like modified Wharncliffe reverse tanto, let's say, with this harpoon swedge. So, I actually really love the general concept of a harpoon swedge on, Wharncliffe reverse tanto knives. So I thought this was a really good execution of that general aesthetic. So I really like that. I also really like that it's a hollow grind knife. So let's see, it might be a little hard to tell, but yeah, this has a fairly decent hollow grind, up to here, not super high, but also not super low either. So very slicey. And in addition to the grind that, contributing to the sliciness is the edge itself. This is a very pretty, what would it be? Low angle edge? I don't know the proper term. Anyway, it's a very slicey edge and blade grind. So I do love that aspect of this knife as well. And lastly, this is in 20 CV. I don't think the camera will want to focus. My iPhone camera for some reason does not like to focus on things super close up, but right here it says CPM 20 CV. So anyway, it's a good blade steel. From what I've heard, I don't have a ton of experience. I have do I have like one or two other knives in 20 CV? But yeah, I haven't had a ton of time using 20 CV, but so far, this version, and then actually, it's this and then my ProTech Malibu that I've been using recently. They're both in 20 CV, so good experiences so far. So yeah, the blade on this knife, a big positive for me. The second thing is I love the ergonomics of this knife. So as I mentioned, the harpoon switch, not only do I like the aesthetics of it, but I like that it creates, a little thumb ramp for your finger. So there is no jimping here, which is kind of a bummer, but I do appreciate that, I feel like the jimping may have kind of not taken away from the overall simplicity of this design, but it would have kind of been a unnecessary sort of visual feature, you could say. So I like that instead of having jimping, I have this thumb ramp to kind of like slide into right there. And then on top of that, I love this generous finger choil on the blade. So I feel perfectly confident having my index finger rest there, and I'm not too worried about slipping up. It is a little shallow, so in that regard, you might be a little, I would be cautious. No, don't be too careless as you're handling it if you're handling it choked up like that. But yeah, so apart from the swedge and the choil, you might be surprised, but this, even though these lines look very angular in a way, and like these look like these could be hot spots, it's surprisingly, at least for my medium glove size hands, very, very natural. There's no real hot spots for me. I think maybe kind of the bill of the clip here, but in terms of the overall profile of the handle, it's really easy. It's really comfortable. Honestly, it's more comfortable choked up, but it's still fairly comfortable when I'm down on just exclusively on the handle. Now, I will point out that I do have to kind of like cramp my grip in order to stay within the confines of these 2 points on the handle. So it's not the most comfortable there. So I do end up just holding it like this, generally speaking, unless I'm doing, some sort of draw cut or whatnot. So yeah, I love the ergonomics of this for the choil, the thumb ramp, and just the overall handle shape. Now, I've kind of alluded to this a little bit, but, I love not just the overall aesthetic, but I love the fact that this is, I would argue, a somewhat minimalistic design. There's no milling patterns, which at the same time I would love the utility of having milling on the titanium, but the smooth titanium, the smooth finish, it is, faceted. It has a flat here, it has the swedge, it has the grind here. But overall, it's this black and bronze knife. It's got, you can see a lot of the screws on the lock side, but thankfully on the show side, very, very minimal visual features. And I guess I might as well point out now, yes, that is a scratch tracing there. I have dropped this knife a few times, unfortunately. We'll get to that more. But yeah, so I love the minimalist aesthetic of this knife while still having a very pronounced and distinctive design language, the Gavko design language. So yeah, kind of hand in hand with the aesthetic, the minimalist aesthetic, is I really appreciate the construction of this. It is a very, very simple construction, which means it's very easy to disassemble and reassemble. So you notice on the show side, the only screw that's on, ignoring the thumb stud on the blade, the only screw on the show side is this one screw, which is for the single pillar backspacer right here. Now, of course, there are more screws here. These two are for the clip exclusively. It has no other function. There's this one for the same backspacer. This one for the, I believe this is a steel lock bar insert, and then for the pivot itself. So you don't even have to mess with the clip or you take the clip screws out if you want to just clean the knife overall. You only have to take out this screw and that screw. That's it. Very simple. Or I guess this screw too. So 3 screws, right? Actually, you don't even have to take it out if you don't want to. You only have to take out one side, I believe. So yeah, very simple construction. So I really appreciate that. Now, another, I guess this is kind of like a sub point about the minimalist aesthetic. I love, and this is not just exclusive to this knife, but I like that the way they incorporate their logo generally is in the pivot rather than putting it somewhere on the show side of the blade or somewhere else on the scales or something like that. I like that their logo is simplistic, and if you're not a knife person, you're not going to assume that this is an actual logo. It's just kind of like a graphic design. So I really appreciate, I guess, maybe the aesthetic of their logo and then the way they incorporate it into this design and many of their other designs. And on top of that, I do like, this is, you notice this collar around the screw here. This is a separate sort of bushing / pivot collar. I don't know if those are mutually exclusive terms or classifications, but yeah, so basically once you start unscrewing this collar actually is kind of sitting around the screw. And I don't know if I've ever been able to actually separate it from the pivot screw. I've only disassembled this once or twice before, so I don't remember trying specifically to disassemble the collar from the pivot screw, but yeah. So that's kind of a cool look in some ways. Now, yeah, some other things that I appreciate about this knife. I love these scales are contoured, so they're rounded. It's not just flat slabs of titanium on the actual sides that your hand interacts with. They are flat on the interior, but in terms of the outside of the scales, they're rounded. So I appreciate that, a little more comfort basically. And you know, I like the overall size of this knife. As someone with my size hands, this is, you know, it's not the most comfortable if I have to, like, if I'm trying to stay really tight on here, but as soon as I choke up, it's more than enough space. So I like that it feels like a bigger knife because you can have all this room to choke up basically. But it's also, you know, big enough to be able to hold with a 4-finger grip, just on the handle alone. So yeah, the size is a good size. And another thing, you know, I think this is, from what I've heard, not uncommon for Wii knives. You know, just the action is fairly smooth. This is on bearings. You know, it's a frame lock on bearings, so it's smooth enough. You know, definitely no complaints with the action. Now, the last thing I'll say is, with this design, it's not super easy for me to accidentally apply extra pressure to the lock bar, which is good because, of course, you know, oh, of course I feel it right there. But yeah, it's really easy for me to deploy this knife with both my thumb and with my middle finger, without real concern about applying lock bar pressure that would, you know, cause me to fail flicking it fully open. So yeah, great. So those are a lot of things that I love about this knife. Now, there are some things that if I had, you know, if I could optimize this for my own personal preferences, again, to my personal preferences, not objectively, but personal preferences, there are things I would change. And in fact, there's one thing that I have changed already. So I'm gonna shine a light in here, hopefully. So you'll notice on the tang of the blade where it's unfinished, where it's, you know, the raw steel, notice that little divot right there. So that is a detent ball ramp. That is not there from the factory. That is something that I dremeled in myself. I've actually done it once before on a Kaiser Mini Therium, which is a liner lock, but still uses detent ball. You know, I found from the factory, there's no ramp there. So basically, I'm catching when there's a, I don't know, I can't remember what the term is, but there's like, not lock stick, but there's whatever the term is, where basically the tang of the blade hits the detent ball, and it was definitely enough of an interference to where it's not naturally just going to surpass the detent ball. You have to put a decent amount of force, more so than I have to now that I've, you know, created this detent ball ramp. So I didn't love the fact that that was there, so I created the detent ball ramp. Which if you haven't done that before, I mean, you want to be careful, but it's not super difficult. I had no previous experience doing it. I've done it twice now. Both times I'm fairly happy with the results compared to what it came from the factory without the ramp at all. Excuse me. So yeah, that is a thing that I already have changed, because to me that is something that I want the closing action to be as smooth as possible, which it's pretty smooth now. Now, another thing that I would like to change is, you know, I've mentioned this in other videos before, is I don't love the concept and just like, yeah, the limitations or the shortcomings of a frame lock, which that being, you know, the risk of inducing extra pressure to the lock bar when you're trying to open it, or even, yeah, I guess now we're trying to close, but yeah, when you're trying to open it. Now for this knife in particular, it's really not an issue, so it's not that big of a deal, but you know, I would definitely like this knife more, I think, if it was a well executed liner lock instead of a frame lock, but not a major deal. And definitely one thing that I've mentioned many times is, you know, I like having multiple deployment methods, not just the dedicated thumb stud. So this would be cool to have a flipper. I think given that you're already having a protrusion here on the scales, this natural tipping point, it honestly wouldn't, like, depending on how big of a flipper you create, it wouldn't be that obstructive to put a flipper there, for me at least, with my hands. And it wouldn't get too much in the way of having this choked up grip. So it would be nice, but you know, not the end of the world. Now, one big thing that I think they could have done, but I imagine they didn't do, I would assume really just to save money on the production, is this knife is, I believe, almost 3.5 ounces. Now, notice inside these scales, there is absolutely no internal milling. There's no weight-saving milling internally. Now, I mean, I'm not an engineer, so I'm not going to claim to know that this is for sure doable without, compromising the strength of the scales, but I feel like they probably could have milled these. I mean, because these scales are fairly thick, honestly. I feel like they could have milled them inside to save maybe, quarter of an ounce. But, not an engineer, so I'm not going to claim that I know better than Michael and the guys at We. So, yeah, it would have been nice just because I think if this knife was even a little lighter, it would feel even... I mean, I just prefer lighter knives overall, so that's, again, a personal preference thing. Now, I mentioned earlier that I love the minimalist aesthetic, but on the flip side of that, I do think if they had done some sort of scale milling, that would add a nice amount of traction to this knife. But, depending on how you're using it, that may be completely unnecessary. But, there is also a unique aesthetic addition if you do choose to use some sort of milling pattern, so it can go either way. Now, one thing that I do think was kind of like a miss from the factory is the clip tension. So notice you hear this like ting sound. It's really not a high tension clip, and notice how skinny the bar of the clip is as soon as you're leaving from the point that attaches to the scales. It is very thin. So I think probably because of how thin it is, this is a relatively weak clip. I believe it is a titanium clip, like a milled titanium clip, but it just doesn't have a lot of pocket tension, which is why this knife has fallen out of my pocket several times, is because it's like the bill of this clip has snagged on things, and because the clip already has low tension, it's very easy to just get snagged out of my pocket by whatever crap. So that explains this scratch, and then I think, yep, there's these little dings here. So having this happen makes me understand why people prefer plain titanium, because it's less visible when dings like this happen to your nice knife. It's not the end of the world by any means, but definitely not. I wish I could obviously not have those scratches. So yeah, the last thing is, if you're fidgeting this for constantly this open in a short period of time, the texturing on the thumb studs is a little like there's not real rounding on it is this tiered, like, I don't know what if there's like a term for it, but this style of thumb stud, it has these decreasing concentric layers. So the edges of those layers are I don't think they're like rounded off at all. I think they're like a true like 90-degree like milling, or however they manufacture these. So it can wear on your thumbs and middle finger a little bit, but it's not terrible, especially if you're not fidgeting with it for a super long period of time. So yeah, I mean, overall, I really like this design. I love the aesthetics of it. I love the blade in particular. I love the construction. I do think, as with almost anything, there are some things that if I was to design, tweak this to my personal preferences, I definitely would. But overall, great design, looks good, great execution, I think. So well made. Blade is it's really easy to center this. I think when it came, like I mentioned, I disassembled it before, so it's I've reassembled it. It's very easy to recenter it when reassembling it. So for people that care about that sort of thing, definitely no issues from the factory with the construction and assembly. So yeah, I plan on holding on to this for at least a little while. Unless someone really is interested in this knife, I definitely would be willing to sell it for under the map pricing. But for now, I like having this knife. I don't carry it that much, honestly, because really it comes down to, I really don't love frame locks. I'd rather have a button lock because it's so much quicker to close. Now, granted, this is not a knife that's slow to close, but it's not nearly as fast as my Malibu or my Pyrite or Altus or whatnot. So I definitely don't carry this as often, and I do think of this, because it's more expensive knife, I do kind of think of it as more of a gentleman's EDC sort of knife, and not something that I just carry day to day. And also the weight of it is not something that I carry every day. So basically, it's not an EDC knife for me. It's kind of like a special occasions knife, and it's great for that. And I really do like the fact that I'm able to own a Gavko design without paying an arm and a leg for a custom, basically. And yeah, that's about it. So if you have any questions about this, or interested in maybe buying it, I guess, feel free to comment in below. Or if you have your own experiences with this knife, the different perspectives on the design and the things that I pointed out, things that I appreciate, things that I wanted to change, feel free to comment about that. Until next time, take care.